do projeto Color of Labour. E é com duplo prazer que isso vai ter lugar com a presença do nosso colega Richard Drayton, que vem do King's College especialmente para o projeto. Richard é conhecido de muitos de vós, não apenas como conselheiro do ICS, mas sobretudo como autor incomparável do tempo contemporâneo. Há uma longa biografia, longa em densidade, não tanto em tempo de vida, mas de densidade de contribuições para o pensamento contemporâneo que Richard nos deu. O seu trajeto pessoal é curioso, único, e eu convido-vos a ver um vídeo de uma entrevista feita pelo Alan McFarlane recentemente com a biografia do Richard, e ela envolve a Guiana, envolve Barbados, envolve o Reino Unido, envolve os Estados Unidos, envolve as universidades de Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge e presentemente King's, e envolve um impacto no pensamento histórico com um tom não europeu que transformou o pensamento da modo de olharmos para império, para sociedades com o impacto de impérios. Can you follow me, Richard? Yeah? Okay, that's great. Dos seus muitos artigos e livros destacam-se o recente Mass of Empire e o menos recente, mas ainda vivíssimo, Nature's Government. O seu interesse e a sua perspectiva a partir do estudo das sociedades do Caribe ou das Antilhas nos problemas estruturais de racialização levam-no a ser um dos interlocutores preferenciais do nosso projeto e do nosso instituto como um todo. Portanto, está apresentado brevemente, espero, o Richard Drayton, e eu vou dar-lhe a palavra e agradecer-lhe mais uma vez ter vindo. Richard, thank you so much for being here. It's a really pleasure and an honor, and now I'll give the word to you and I'll leave the place and give you the word. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Christiana, for inviting me here and for this very warm welcome. I'm particularly pleased to be part of the work of this ERC project, The Colour of Labour, which seems to me to be likely to pioneer not just in empirical terms, but in theoretical terms, some important new ground for the social sciences in Europe. It's a particular pleasure, too, to visit again the Institute of Social Sciences in Lisbon, which represents a very special European social scientific institute in terms of the way in which it seeks to bring together historical, anthropological, geographical, psychological, and other social scientific disciplines towards making sense of the social terrain. I look forward this afternoon to my conversations with the researchers in this project who are working on, as I recall, the problem of gender and race in domestic labor in Mauritius, the problem of migrant labor in Italy across the 20th and early 21st centuries from both Eastern Europe and Africa, the problem of migrants from Madeira and Portugal in general in Hawaii, and the problem, not least, of the situation of Madeirans in British Guyana. I'm forgetting also the Portuguese migration to North America. Now, how the organization of work interacted with the construction of racial status identities is central to your important project. And my contribution to your work today is derived from my participation in a project on the global bourgeoisie led by Jürgen Osterhammel, Christophe de Jong, and David Mottedel. This will yield a book with Princeton University Press, to which I contributed a chapter. At first glance, the problem of the global bourgeoisie might not seem likely to illuminate your problematic of the colour of labour. But middle classes perform important kinds of work too, and how they construct and enjoy status is completely related to how the poorest workers are raced and classed. Indeed, if there's one thing which I'd like you to remember from today, is the assertion that I'm making that we need to think about regimes of status, whether we're thinking about race or class or gender or caste or other kinds of status difference, as being co-produced. In other words, race is not a thing, class is not a thing. It is indeed, as most of us know, a social relation. So we need to understand how social relations are produced, which generate these systems of status identities. Certainly, among the puzzles you seek to solve is how migrants who left Madeira for hard agricultural work in tropical colonies within 2 or 3 generations came to occupy the lower middle class strata of British colonial societies. They occupied this location, but not in any simple way. And I offer as a bit of evidence here the story of my father's mother's brother, George. Now, my father's mother was of Madeiran origin, that's to say, in terms of the patois of British Guyana, Padigi. Now, George decided in 1939, when Britain went to war, to present himself at the garrison to volunteer to join the British Army, only to be told politely by the officer that he could not be a member of the British Army because he was not European. And this had to do with the fact that in terms of the census of that colony and the locations into which people were inscribed on their birth certificates, Portuguese represented a census category which was distinct from European. So what we're seeing here is a very interesting instance of how the ways in which the fact that Madeirans Portuguese had first been inserted in that society as agricultural labor, that is to say, in the location of black slaves, decades after, the stigma of low-status work still attached to them and located them within a class structure, operating within a race structure at the lowest echelon of whiteness. Now, had this same man presented himself at the garrison in Barbados, only a few hundred miles away, and also another British colony in the Greater Caribbean, he would have been enrolled in the British Army, because in terms of the constructions of race and class in that society, there was no distinction made between Portuguese and other Europeans, because, of course, Portuguese had never been part of the structure of labor in that society. Of course, a little bit later, in apartheid South Africa, as you all know, African American and Japanese businessmen were sometimes awarded the status of honorary whites, with their economic class location ordering a segmentation within what was otherwise a very strict either-or regime of racial classification. Now, it seems to me that the European social scientific toolkit is not actually very effective in understanding these kinds of social experiences. And indeed, if we want to look for the earliest literatures attempting to problematize this, we need to look at what we might call, per the Komarovs, theory from the South, and the ways in which people who were on the underside of these social relations understood them and sought to explain them in terms of their full complexity. So I think one who looks at the work of Du Bois, it is well known that Du Bois was thinking very clearly about the problems of the interactions of class and race at the beginning of the 20th century. Or we could turn, if we're turning now to the region from which I come, to the Trinidadian Eric Williams in Capitalism and Slavery of 1944, in which he offered a classic statement of the correlation of race and class. Now, Capitalism and Slavery is better known for 2 other controversial arguments, one about the role of the Atlantic system in the origins of the Industrial Revolution and economic and social modernity in Britain, and another important argument, the importance of slave resistance in the process of emancipation. But in the very first chapter of Capitalism and Slavery, Williams offers an argument about the interactions of race and class, through which he seeks to explain both the succession from Amerindian servile labor to white indentured labor, eventually giving way to African slave labor on the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, which generated the status identity of the black in these plantation societies. Williams might have gone further. Indeed, if we look at the importance of places like Brazil and the Caribbean in terms of constituting global regimes of race, we might even suggest that this is something not just of specific Caribbean or indeed of British importance, but indeed of global historical importance. Less well-known interventions, because they were contained in political rather than scholarly documents. Indeed, they were contained in bodies of social thought coming out of essentially the CPUSA, the American Communist Party. We might look at the Trinidadian George Padmore's The Life and Struggles of Negro Toilers of 1931, in which Padmore argues that if we're looking at the way in which class operates and the forms of class mobilization which need to be made sense of by the left in 1931, we need to make sense of the autonomy of race in terms of shaping forms of segmentation and forms of alliance and forms of contradiction within the working class. Or we could look at the work of the Trinidadian, again, interestingly enough, Claudia Jones, in her essay, which is foundational to all of the later literatures on so-called intersectionality. Claudia Jones, in her essay, The End to the Neglect of the Problems of Negro Women of 1949, in which she raised the autonomy of gender as a factor interacting with class and race in terms of organizing forms of status identity in terms of modern societies. Now, there is, of course, today a growing literature on the interactions between different kinds of status regimes. But in general, the social sciences have far to go still in mapping how race was classed and how class was raced, and how both of these interacted with gender and other kinds of status difference. Well, my contribution to your conversations begins with a journey to 100 years before that 20th century climax of the plantation regime with which I began in British Guyana, in order to examine some of the deficiencies in how global historical sociology has historically addressed race and its interactions with class. In 1837, 3 years into the period of apprenticeship, as it was called, which followed the Emancipation Act in the British Empire, 2 American abolitionists visited Barbados. They sought out the small community of wealthy, free-colored businessmen who clustered in the capital city, Bridgetown. They visited the home of Joseph Thorne, who'd been a slave until the age of 20. On one side was a large library of religious, historical, and literary works, and the selection of which displayed no small taste and judgment. I'm quoting here. On the opposite side of the room was a fine cabinet of minerals and shells. In one corner stood a number of curious relics of the Aboriginal Caribs, such as bows and arrows, together with interesting fossil remains. On the tops of the bookcases and mineral stand were birds of rare species, procured from the South American continent. Thorne's respectability was buttressed not just by his intellectual taste, his education, his manners, but by his decision to adhere to the Anglican Church, of which he was a lay catechist, rather than as most people of color had been. He had not sought the more welcoming congregations of the Methodists, Baptists, or Moravians. But his political activities still put him into confrontation with the white planters and merchants with which he shared the pew. With other members of that small, urban, prosperous group of colored brokers and middlemen, Thorne was one of the sponsors of the newspapers The New Times and The Liberal, published by the free-colored journalist Samuel Jackman Prescott between 1836 and 1837. These pressed for the removal of disabilities suffered by people of color, for the end of apprenticeship, and for radical parliamentary reform, which would allow educated propertied men, whatever their skin shade, to vote for and sit in the House of Assembly, the local legislature. In 1839, an anonymous column in the Liberal proposed that in future the middle orders, rather than the excessively rich, should govern society. Versus the guzzling corruption of the rich, characterized by habits of gratification, producing mental incapacity and moral deadness, it offered a government of a frugal, educated, industrious middle class, in quotations. They were self-identifying, in other words, with this particular political cohort, which was a social cohort, which of course at this time had its sponsors in any European city. Except that in the context of Barbados or Jamaica or Trinidad, these middle orders were middle in more senses than property. They were key brokers in the social life of the city, operating in terms of as mediators, taking on special responsibilities of leadership, protection, and patronage towards that majority of unlettered manual workers, which in 1838 emerged from slavery. They sought to propagate both religion and new respectful modes of marriage, much as Prashant Kidambi has argued, the emerging middle classes of 19th century India sought to encourage purity, thrift, and public decency among the vulgar masses of Bombay as they negotiated their status relation relative to racialized as white occupying colonial presence. How do we make sense of this social formation in early 19th century Barbados, which had its equivalents in every society across the Americas, in Cape Town and Freetown, in Africa and elsewhere? It's unclear sometimes whether class and class formation are even sometimes recognized as global phenomena. It's striking, for example, that Julian Goh and George Lawson, in their 2017 manifesto work, Global Historical Sociology, do not even address class as a key analytic problem. Where there is a mature literature on a global middle class, it concerns 20th century social formations, in particular in the post-colonial and neoliberal moments. For the 19th century, it is assumed that the middle classes find their locus classicus in 19th century Europe. And that is where we find that ideal of a social class attached to an idea of Bildung and with a particular political self-consciousness. And it's assumed, therefore, that non-Western colonial bourgeoisies are simply derivative of what was happening in Europe in the early 19th century, whereas in fact, perhaps they were being co-produced at the same time, even if in fact our historical attention, so the co-production of this class formation, has not always been sensitive, partly because in fact the ways in which race has operated not simply as an excluded category of social analysis, but as something which in fact has indeed written outside the script of social analysis a variety of social actors. Now, Osterhammel in his masterwork on the 19th century urges us to examine how the greater social differentiation fueled by population growth and with the general expansion of regional and sub-regional trade and business activity led to the growth in the weight of middle ranks in societies around the world. And his question is comparative, extending that distinguished tradition of the pursuit of universal history via mapping parallels, for which Max Weber remains the doyen. The comparative approach can lead to powerful interpretive insight. The brilliance of Weber's essay in Economy and Society on class, status, group, and party is to propose three axes for social analysis: group formation around the division of labor and property, group formation around honor, and group formation around identity as collective agency and cultural property, which come very close to transcending their modern European anchorage. And you'll see that my analysis is really attempting to work with these three axes and to expand them. But the provenance of this comparative approach leads to a kind of drag, to the extent that the anthropological imagination of liberal Europe circa 1900, presuming the existence of discrete, disconnected national and regional experiences, is locked into a kind of diffusionism, which makes it far more difficult for us to understand the ways in which these forms of interaction and connection that were part of the history of globalization were in fact producing what we might call multi-ethnogenesis. That is to say, the simultaneous generation of many ethnicities in one system of related status identities. Because multi-ethnogenesis, which has not just happened once, but at several times in different locations and at different scales of social interaction in human history, has been involved in generating systems of relational ethnic national state identities and systems of ethnic and other kinds of hierarchical social status identities. So I think that the question which I would then want to frame would be how were middle elements co-produced in different places? How might we identify forms of convergence between varieties of middling elements in international society over the 19th and 20th centuries? What, however, Weber achieves in Economy and Society is to clarify the work which class and other instruments of status distinction are doing in social life. On the one hand, they organize forms of monopolization, in which groups command privileged locations relative to material or ideal resources or social roles, for which they then exclude other groups present in the society. Charles Tilly, in a 2001 intervention, extends the Weberian approach in arguing that inequality is organized and propagated across time and space through inequality-generating mechanisms or exploitation, when one group involves others in the production of value, which they do not share, and also by opportunity hoarding, in which a value-producing resource is kept to members of an in-group. On the other, the flip side of this is that status distinctions among those who share a rank organize spaces of encounter. They create a terrain for commensality and nuptiality, for negotiation and alliance, opening up the possibility of those who are not kin entering into networks of collective action, support, sympathy, and trust. The middle class in every society is both middle in terms of status and middle in terms of its capacity for engagement with social groups above or below. It has an important role in mediating precisely how labor's color and color's labor operate across the spectrums of societies. It is this global history of mediation that we should turn. If we seek to explore the question of the global middle class via connective rather than comparative history, we need to ask how the registers of social differentiation were transformed on a global scale, with European class, status, and party identities as much a product of this transnational turn as those in Latin America or Asia or Africa. And it's my hypothesis that the global history which surrounded the construction of the early modern European imperial globalization, that's to say the span from 1500 through to 1800, and which reached its maturity in the early 19th century, the culmination of what German historians sometimes call the Sattelzeit, that period from 1750 to 1850, which constituted forms of modernity. That this process of imperial globalization had three key effects. First, the moment of European hegemony in the late modern period after 1750 was correlated with the internal integration of Western Christendom, of which ideas of civilization and whiteness, indeed of Europe as a discrete continent, were consequences, and with an ever-expanding external regime of linkages between Western European and non-European social formations. Second, connected to these linked processes of integration, often in the midst of competitive warfare and external linkage, again often associated with violence and constrained consent, was the production of and ascent in importance of mediating groups at the periphery, negotiators, brokers, merchants, including small shopkeepers, translators, middlemen, subaltern fixers, in the original meaning of the word subaltern, that's to say junior officer, not in the way in which in the theoretical sense it's acquired, overseers, work captains, gang masters, accountants, lesser managers as well as greater ones, artisans at various levels, pilots on ships in every part of the world, for which the European bourgeoisie was in fact only a local and a privileged expression. So we need to think really about this kind of global production of mediation, which is part of the history of capitalism and that integration of the world by European imperial systems, which is producing these systems of status identity, each with their local variable characteristics in a variety of theaters of international society. Thirdly, linked to that violent integration of international society and the associated premium on mediation and mediators, which of course is the role which our Portuguese are playing in a place like British Guyana. They're being squeezed from a working class into becoming this mediating role because the society needed that mediating role. And as a result, their status identity changes and labor's color is changed somewhat in terms of that articulation. But linked to that violent integration of international society and the associated premium on mediation and mediators was a process of the standardization of social imaginaries, manners, customs, a pressure driving towards the reduction of specific complexity into general categories, towards uniformity. An integrated world could only be made sense of, indeed could only be massified, through forms of oversimplification or ignoring of complexity, or the performance by those, in fact, who are in a subordinate location of simplicity. The key question then becomes, how are these regimes of status standardized around the world, mass-produced, mass-marketed, and made exchangeable? If we approach the history of race in global terms from this perspective, what we begin to recognize is that the theorization of race as it emerges in the 18th century with figures like Linnaeus and Blumenbach and Buffon, in fact is merely an epiphenomenon arising from these forms of simplification of identities, which generate these types, which are marked by skin color, by qualities of hair, of eyes, and which then operate as these regimes on an international scale, squeezing human complexity into a simplicity which can be managed, or, to use another language, which can be efficiently priced, in terms of what we can think of as a global market of status, a global bourse of honor. Now, in the volume, the Princeton volume, there are several wonderful chapters which look at the material history of mediation as a dimension of modern global history in throwing up these middle classes. And this is a significant advance on the somewhat idealist approach of people like Dror Warman, later globalized by David Cannadine, which seeks class in forms of social imagination. Social class ideas clearly mattered, but their purchase on the world depended on the work they do and did, on their value as lenses to particular interests and for forms of collective action. Imagined communities are not just simply nations. Imagined communities are also ethnicities and classes. The rise of a global bourgeoisie certainly depended on particular psychocultural formations, but it was equally the expression of ever denser and more dynamic forms of economic and political, local and global integration, which constituted a set of men and women in the middle of an expanding set of connections. So we should begin to think about the making of international social history as not just associated with, but formally similar to the processes which produced regional and international market economies. In thinking about economies of status, we have the encouragement of Weber himself, who compared racial exclusion in the first volume of Economy of Society with the cartel behavior of economic actors. Cartel behavior is, of course, a posture relative to a market. The key to the market is the principle of fungibility. That is to say that everything can or should be violently simplified to an exchange value, which allows it to enter into conversation with other things through some kind of currency, silver, Spanish piastre, gold, pound sterling, or dollars, which operates as a material lingua franca. Global history in the 1500 to 1800 period produced an analogous international bourse of honor, an analogous set of currencies of status through which European integration and global social linkages could take place, premised on violent simplifications. It is in this process of integration, standardization, and simplification that race, class, and culture become, I'm arguing, the critical axes of status identity and group dynamics in international society. To this extent that we can talk about a global history of the bourgeoisie, its members recognize themselves both locally and international society through its locations within and membership of particular simplified modern meanings of ethnic, rank, and ideological and aesthetic communities. By race, class, and culture, I mean concretely ideas of whiteness versus others understood as on a spectrum or as an amalgamated non-whiteness, of bi- and tri-class social cleavage around the division of labor, property, and social prerogative, of civilization for which Christianity, education, aesthetic taste and manners, forms of collective voluntary action and charity were in varying ways signifiers. Those who wished to participate in a world dominated by Europe had to negotiate their place relative to these ways of seeing, institutions and practices. They had to submit to the weights and measures of the global status market. Or they had to reach within and form alternative, related registers of honor, status, and collective identity, which might be formally compared to and traded with, and might even do battle with, the forms of Western norms inscribed within the international system. So that Joseph Thorne and his circle in early 19th century Barbados were only one example of this global phenomenon of accommodation and contestation, which is constituting the inner and outer life of status identities. Now, Christopher Bailey, at the opening of The Birth of the Modern World, argued that by the era of the First World War, a certain uniformity of dress and deportment was visible in the meeting places of international society. I'd invite you to think about this collusion of manners really as an indicator of how a contemporary regime of power was driving convergence in social identities and ideas of honor. What did it mean, in other words, for lots of people, lots of men who sought to be taken seriously in early 20th century to think of themselves, to dress themselves in suits? Or indeed, as Bailey argues in his later work, Recovering Liberties from 2011, what did it mean for non-European groups to invest themselves in the political language of liberalism? What I'd like to suggest that what we're seeing there is a form of tactical and constrained participation of non-Western actors in the norms of a dominant group. To understand this, it might be helpful to turn to the language of the Martinique poet and philosopher Edouard Glissant, where he talks about forced poetics. Forced poetics representing the ways in which those who seek to enjoy forms of political, economic, or even psychological personhood need to perform membership in terms of the forms of the dominant group. The mediating groups of international society, generated by the material history of early and late modern globalizations, were compelled to negotiate their status in a field of power relations for which race, class, and culture, understood in particular 19th century ways, were significant dimensions. And the taking of middle-class identities and manners by people in the spaces subject to European domination was in part constrained consent, in part resistance to their predicament. Mimesis of social class behavior, in which aspiring colonial bourgeoisies rehearsed elements of the European bourgeois cultural habitus, is certainly in some ways could be understood as simple West to non-West transfer and diffusion. But I'd invite you to think in a Taussigian way that mimicry of status norms can often be a form of self-defense, in which dissent is coded in the agency of the performer, a claiming of membership in the modern. And we may see this complex of mimesis and subversive mimicry, for example, in Marcus Garvey's decision to bestow the titles of Duke of the Nile and Baron of the Zambezi on his Pan-African allies. So I might brutally simplify the argument which I've taken you along so far into two key claims. First, that globalization, understood as the articulation of capitalism and governmentality, required mediators of all kinds and created the global middle classes an sich, in the German sense, a space in themselves, creating a space of social predicament and opportunity simultaneously among a number of societies. But that secondly, that European hegemony compelled these people in the middle to negotiate their value in the international Bourse of Honor, creating the global middle classes für sich, in the German sense, for themselves, as self-conscious participators. The partner of the European integration of the world, which had on its inner substance the creation of a variety of subordinate identities, but also the creation of middle-class identities and relationships within Europe, was connected to a transnational process of social class identity formation in the periphery. Middle classes, each specific to their local context, working classes, each specific to their local context, but also a mimetic conversation with social formations elsewhere, emerged across the world. For these global bourgeoisies, ideas of race, social rank, and culture and civilization became entangled in claims to status, which were themselves mediators of claims to rights. Now, we are scarcely, to repeat my claim from the beginning, at the start of understanding the complex, entangled global histories of status and class formation. And this is first because race and ethnic difference, while the central metal in transnational alloys of status across the modern era, is a neglected term of social scientific analysis. But more fundamentally, we've not usually thought about how different kinds of domination, subordination, and equality can be connected in economies of status. Some productive beginnings in this direction have come in the new literatures on intersectionality and kyriarchy, which have emerged out of critical race and gender studies. These have suggested that class and status group formation has for quite a long time, for centuries, if not indeed for millennia, been quietly entangled with ideas of gender and ethnicity. And the modern global history of classes, both working and middle, appealed to a far older infrastructure of stereotyped and simplified orders of identity and status. The ideological management of status and inequality in relationship to cultural identity and difference took characteristic forms in every society. But with the rise of ancient imperial systems, these came into convergence and exchange. For Western registers of status difference, the clear point of origin lies in the legacies of Roman imperial assumptions. And thus the image on the title slide, the Barberini Polyptych, a carved ivory leaf in the Louvre Museum from the early 6th century, Byzantine Empire, which depicts probably the Emperor Justinian, while providing us with a luminous window onto the overlapping registers of distinction which organized antique society and which shaped modern European ideas of status. It correlates imperial power with a variety of other kinds of dominance. Divine power anoints the emperor from above, while his mastery of a well-broken, elegant horse dominates the work, complemented by the submission of a woman, Tellus, the amply bosomed female earth goddess, who touches his foot while vainly seeking his approving gaze. While in the register below, ethnically different peoples, bearded men from the west and Indians from the east, with lions and elephants among them, supplicate themselves and bring tribute. Imperial power, long before Byzantium and into our own time, has always been correlated with particular constellations of human-animal, gender, race, class, dominance, and subordination. And indeed, I have quite another lecture I could give you which attempts to try to look at this kind of longue durée approach to understanding the origins of modern identities. But let's jump forward. When Western Eurasians sailed outwards to Africa and the Americas circa 1500, they carried with them this complicated economy of macro and micro scales of domination and status difference. They found terms of exchange with the status regimes they encountered, and a vast, scarcely mapped hybrid history of social imaginaries of human, animal, gender, ethnic, and status group identities opened up. The central category within this emerged as race, as the core of new kinds of ethnic and status identities, across a world of European trading and colonial enclaves. The intrusion of plantation and mining economies had profound consequences on modern status identities, in part because indigenous and chattel slavery were their recurrent partners. It's important to insist that plantation society was not just a social form located only in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the American South. The entire West was a plantation society, shaped by the commodities and identities being generated in the tropical hotspots of early modern globalization. It's a convenient myth that there were parts of Europe, say London or Amsterdam, involved in overseas trade, while other places far from the ocean continued their innocent inner European life. From the opening of Habsburg power in the 16th century, it was the capacity of maritime powers to mobilize the entire continent, selling sugar in Geneva and coffee in Dresden, which made these empires possible. And thus, every educated European, even deep in the hinterlands of the continent, participated in European imperial globalization and consumed and retailed, along with coffee and sugar, the idea of whiteness and the difference of Europeans from Africans and Asians. The historian of science, Staffan Muller-Wille, has alerted us to the provenance of Linnaeus's distinctions between racial formations in his classic 18th century work. Staffan Muller-Wille proposes, and I think it's a provocative and indeed possibly even a compelling argument, that really was from colonial Brazil and from the observations in Piso and Markgrave's Historia Naturalis Brasiliae of 1648, that we first find the description of, well, the Scientific Observer describes this with surprise, saying that, do you know that here in Brazil, Portuguese, Dutch, German, French, and English are called the Europeans? This comes as something which puzzles him, such as it requires description in genere autem vocant omnes Europaeus. So that there's something happening in these plantation societies in terms of constituting this collective identity, simplifying this European identity, relative to which other kinds of simplifications were taking place. Because, of course, the parallel to this was the construction of an idea of Africans as not merely sharing a continental provenance, but also a persistent set of civilizational characteristics. The science of race was not first made in the books of philosophers, nor Pache Winthrop Jordan in primordial attitudes. It acquired its modern meaning in structures of social practices. Plantation slavery indelibly marked those with dark skins for servitude. The transfer of the fact of servitude into an idea of natural subordinacy and of difference into inferiority happened easily and influenced religious and scientific ideas about human diversity and its meaning. And so this is the substrate onto which, as I've suggested earlier, that we can understand the emergence of scientific racial ideas in the 18th and indeed in the early 19th centuries. And in particular, this transformation of what had been the idea of race at the beginning of the early modern period, where race, if one looks at the earliest uses of this word, describe a relationship to locality. So that it's a Scandinavian word that describes particular kinds of places, rivers, and indeed these kinds of meanings are still alive today in English, where we talk about the race of Yorkshiremen. That's to say, people who are produced by a particular place and therefore share the characteristics of that place. What, however, happens in that 17th and 18th century moment is the transformation of race from an idea which is linked to a fixity of place to an idea of a portable, transmissible set of characteristics. A race, as Buffon writes in the Histoire Naturelle, is something which can propagate itself, multiply itself, and conserve in perpetuity through generations all the characteristics which may distinguish it from other races. That experience of mass uprooting and relocation, which European imperialism imposed on Africa and Amerindia and on itself after 1500, generated these new ideas of race, which themselves became instruments for further expansion of spheres of expropriation, exploitation, and domination. Now, the New World idea of race as heritable natural difference, which marked whiteness and its others, signs of civilizational capacity, came to shape how Europeans met people in Asia and Africa. Now, there is a significant body of work to be written about the transmission from the Atlantic system to Asia of these registers of status. And I offer just as one document of this, George Everest of the eponymous mountain, that's say Mount Everest, writing to the President of the Royal Society in 1830, offering a fascinating document of the 19th century, the early 19th century, migration of New World racial imaginaries to the Old. And I quote, "When an Englishman arrives in India and finds himself accosted by groups of people, he looks on as niggers and infidels." Now, that movement of the word nigger is very interesting, because what it's telling us is that there's a particular way of seeing that is being taken via this category and mapped onto another set of social actors. An N-gram search for the appearance of the word nigger in English language book identities identifies its climax only from the 1830s onwards. Paradoxically, but perhaps not so surprisingly, correlated with the ends of formal slavery. This idea of the nigger brought in the baggage of the 19th century Englishman to India, Egypt, Malaya, or even China, is one of the clearest examples of that simplified way of imagining social identity, which became globalized in the 19th century. And its impact can be seen in how non-Western mediating social groups and elites had to construct strategies of status making through property, manners, culture, and civility. It might be said that the strategies of status making applied by non-European middle classes were merely based on the importing of European bourgeois norms, whether high collars or piano lessons. But they were influenced also by another legacy of early modern globalization. For side-by-side ideas of radical social difference, racial difference rather, had emerged the possibility of religious, cultural, or civilization, or even in some cases biological embranchimento, to take the Brazilian term. That through mixture and through the transformation of non-whites, through Christian conversion and Western education, one could in fact transform the nature of their actual operation as biological entities and as social entities. So within the locus classicus of plantation societies, middling groups defined by racial ancestry, by mixed racial ancestry, by property, and by conversion to Christianity, the kinds of people who staffed the Pardo militias of Spanish America, were the necessary basis of white and colonial domination and privilege. On the other side of the world, in Asia, the possibility of inducting non-Europeans into the manners and civilization of the West, if not to Christianity, was an equivalent project. In the East, from the Ottoman Empire to Persia, to India and China, Europeans negotiated with local systems of rank and status, approximating those at their higher echelon to themselves. From those confronting European xenologies, forms of mimicry and adaptation could provide spaces of negotiation. And thus, ideas of ethnicity, civilization, and civilizational potential and social rank were entangling in complex ways, racing class into subtle, hybrid, hierarchical regimes of status. This was certainly the case for the core regimes of the plantation system, but one might argue that it was also informing social relations in other parts of the world. Where non-whites, whether in Europe, Asia, the Near East, or Africa, met Europeans on terms of relative equality, in particular in military and economic terms, race and nation were less important to the economies of status and identity than social rank and religious location. It seems clear, however, that the climax of European power in the 19th century, correlated with post-industrial warfare, economy and government, gives race a dramatically new meaning in the global economies of status. I would argue that from circa 1850, we see the consolidation of an idea of a white international, for which the idea of civilization was a key signifier, which would have a powerful influence on international society, even through the 20th century, in and after the Cold War into our own time. In that period, we might argue race was classed, and ethnic difference expressed as phenotype acquired. Pache David Canadine's rather simplistic analysis, powerful weight as a tacit mark of status and group identity, whatever rupture emerged in its association with a genetic privilege. Race penetrated all other indices of status. Whiteness mattered more rather than less, paradoxically, with the crisis of the plantation regime. Instead of the clear and rigid orders of status, inclusion and exclusion, new orders of race and class organized an economy of personhood. And Weber's examination of race and ethnicity is in part sensitive to this. He discusses, for example, the problem of the poor whites in the United States, in which a form of honor compensated for another kind of status inferiority. It seems clear, too, that within Europe, in Weber's own time, that in a similar way, class inequality was being made more stable by the idea that there was a world of racial and colonial subordinates. Genovese, in the world the slaveholders made, notes how in the United States, democratic politics and the end of slavery was associated with a more virulent racism, the violent manufacture of status difference, aimed at a new democratic form of monopolization and opportunity hoarding. And perhaps his model might be extended to understand what we more about some of the more somber passages of 20th century European history. While we think of the 1850 to 1945 period as one of violent competition between the European powers, its other dimension was an unprecedented degree of collaboration and integration of the European empires into an imagined international system for which Europe, and indeed whiteness, was the arbiter. We might argue that the kind of last climax of this particular convergence came in southern Africa with the alliance between the colonial regimes in Angola and Mozambique and their fellows across the border in Rhodesia and in South Africa. But if I can jump forward a little bit, the climax of European hegemony in the international system we might see as a moment of multi-ethnogenesis, in the sense that it generated side by side and entangled together a new set of racial identities. Among these, blackness was the key to all the other pigments, as the protagonist of Ralph Ellison's novel, The Invisible Man, discovered. But its partner was the Chinese, now degenerate rather than enlightened, the Indian, thuggish and vile rather than he had been noble, and against these, whiteness, together with those races, Amerindian and Aborigine, imagined as fit for extinction. As Patrick Wolfe showed with the Aborigines in Australia, it was imagined that there might be a kind of progressive breeding then into a kind of whiteness. In Brazil, a kind of embranchimento was similarly imagined. The boundaries, as we know, operated differently, however, in the United States. But racialized difference was radically entwined with status and historical destiny. And the corollary of this consolidation of a tighter idea of Europe's difference from the rest of the world was an amalgamation of others into either an earlier or lower state of social and cultural evolution. Modern personhood, to put it another way, to borrow the vocabulary of Charles Mills, constructed side-by-side European domination, was initially highly raced, with Europe as in the civilizational equivalent to Blumenbach's Caucasus. That's to say, the place from which other forms degenerated. Some, like the Japanese or Iranians, perhaps were more competent to become modern than those of African descent, but all had to fight to prove their membership, their capacity to be part of the full personhood in the modern world. And I think we can follow these stories across a variety of colonial and social theaters, not just in the colonies, but even within Europe. Because the performance of the right to membership in European society also in some ways is very much connected with the forms of Italian and Spanish and Portuguese colonialism in the 20th century. That these are forms of performance relative to what were in fact the privileged norms of mid-20th century European society. But if one looks at the periphery, one can find groups like J.J. Thomas's circle in 19th century Trinidad, out of which people like George Padmore and C.L.R. James, in a sense, come a generation or so later. Or the fin de siècle Asian intellectuals discussed by Pankaj Mishra, who are inclined to construct a familiar defensive claim of their own modern personhood. And securing such membership of the modern represented the terrain on which working classes throughout the periphery either sought to become middle class or to distinguish themselves from those who were truly at the lowest rung. Education, political nationalism, literature, theatre, music, projects of reform and state-making, these were, of course, the battlefields on which the third estate in Europe had sought to make itself central to public life. For the mediating groups of the non-European world, elite and middling, on the other hand, similar campaigns would have to be fought in order to negotiate the status of simply being fully human. The colour of labour, I've been arguing, was a terrain of contestation, and not merely of forms of externally imposed status. In the construction of modern global capitalism across many centuries, forms of local status difference were forced to translate themselves into an international currency, within which forms of racial hierarchy, for which the plantation order was fundamental, governed orders of social class, mediated by forms of cultural display, and by challenges to the logic of stratification. Or in Charles Mill's argument, into the negotiation of new kinds of modern personhood. Thank you. Yes. I'm very happy to take questions. Okay. Yes, of course. And comments.
Thank you so much for this extraordinary lecture. And now I will open the room for questions, and whoever wants to.
Could people introduce themselves also?
Yes, and Mari will bring the microphone around the room for questions. Don't be shy. Come on. Okay. Ricardo, then Irene. I'll take notes.
Thank you, Richard. My name is Ricardo. Yes, my question is, how do you fit the indigenous status regimes into your global history? How they interact with because the way you were sort of framing it was mostly about Western status regimes and class and race. So I would like to know more about what this means in the story. Yeah.
Thank you very much. As I was suggesting, forms of status regimes took a variety of kinds in different parts of the world. With the emergence of not simply forms of exchange between Europe and the rest of the world, but forms of domination and of unequal exchange as they emerge in the post-1750 period, what we have, in fact, is the containing of these local status regimes into a much more simplified international economy of status regimes. So there's a kind of exchange of currency where a lesser, weaker currency is exchanged for a more valuable, more exchangeable form of currency within which its meaning is reduced. So rather like the way in which international development analysts will describe wages in societies in terms of dollars per day, translating everything down to a currency which has the highest possible degree of exchange value. In much the same way, these forms of local status identity, relative to the degree of European presence and domination on the ground, were forced to locate themselves in terms of these status imaginaries which were brought from Europe, and which themselves were in each of these societies developed a particular kind of hybrid tension. And that partly why I began with that example from Madeira translated to British Guyana. And of course, one of the things which I'd be very interested to learn from your project, from reading the work that comes out of your project, is to what extent the kind of feudal society which operated in Madeira also shaped the ways in which the Madeirans performed or operated as class actors within societies like British Guyana or St. Vincent or elsewhere. I think this question of how it is that these forms of implicit understanding and misunderstanding on which international society operates which are because it's essentially what is happening to create a more mobile international system. Forms of simplification are happening, and these simplifications involve kinds of deliberate containment and mistranslation of local status hierarchies. The interesting question which arises from your question, which I did not address in my paper, is what happens when European domination breaks down? And to what extent do we see the re-emergence of these older forms of local status difference and hierarchy? I mean, one of the interesting and most important grounds for thinking about this is the whole question of communal and caste difference in South Asia. There was, of course, a very kind of strong structuralist argument in the late 20th century that caste distinctions were in some ways directly the products, at least in their modern forms, of the forms of colonial society created by the British. There are some, of course, who would argue that the story is much more complex and that that we need to, in looking at how caste operates in 20th and 21st century India, we have to make sense both of the pre-colonial forms, but also of the forms of status difference which are organized within post-colonial capitalist society in India. So I think the moment we begin to ask the question, how do local status regimes interact with international ones? For example, why are skin whitening creams objects of such great consumption, not just in South Asia, but increasingly in East Asia? That seems to me is a very interesting index of the ways in which this international currency of status begins to have impact within societies which previously had not understood themselves in quite such clear ways as shaped by the black-white difference which existed in Atlantic societies.
Yeah, thanks very much. Irene Peano from the Color Project.
What was your name?
Irene Peano.
Yes.
I wanted to bring up one example, or maybe two, but from historians of the Atlantic slave trade and the demise of the Atlantic slave trade, in particular in the Bight of Biafra, to actually maybe complexify your idea of simplification, because actually there is evidence that British merchants in that period, so the early 19th century, I think, were actually members of the secret societies of the Calabar area, and they were actually engaging in masquerades, which were the means by which the local elite was enforcing debt and therefore kind of keeping this sort of power structure in place, which allowed for the Atlantic trade. And therefore, so the question there is, I mean, what kind of mimicry is at play in this, and how does it fit into your analysis, basically?
Thank you very much. It fits perfectly, because what my argument is that it is significant to look at those theatres where there are forms of effective European domination, which really only reached their culmination in the 19th century with the forms of economic and military transformations of the 19th century world. And if we're looking at the Atlantic world, particularly in Africa, in the 17th or 18th centuries, Europeans are not in a position of strength. Europeans are in a position of great vulnerability. They are not controlling the terms of the societies in which they operate. They are operating much as they are in Asia, as guests in a very complicated local matrix of economic and social and cultural relations. And precisely in these spaces, there's the possibility for the forms of accommodation, which involve, one of the images I use with my undergraduates is this image of the arrival of Dutch merchants in 1642 to the Kingdom of the Congo. And you find these Europeans prostrating themselves before the court of Congo because they wish to open up commerce. This represents a period prior to that late 19th century moment in which the forms of military and economic power which Europeans had at their disposal allowed them to impose very different terms of encounter. I would like to say, however, that just as a kind of one bit of complexity that might arise in this, however, is that I do think probably that if we were to look at the forms of associational life in colonial Ghana, or Nigeria, that we might find peculiar ways in which, even then, there were forms of mimicry of the majority population within which they lived. And that I think is something which a kind of skilled historical anthropology may well be able to illuminate, for example, in how exactly cultures of things like Freemasonry operated, in which I'm reasonably confident that precisely the pattern which is described for Calabar would be repeated in an attenuated and slightly different form in terms of the emergence of a kind of hybrid local form of Freemasonic culture, which had its own, rather as in Haiti, forms of signification and behavior, which were being shaped by other non-Western kinds of imaginaries. But I think it's important for me that we're looking at a process which has its earliest period in these societies in the Atlantic world on the western side of the Atlantic, where there is effective European domination, which consolidates ways of seeing which have to accommodate themselves on the ground. That something very different happens in the 19th century, which is linked to this the set of transformations I talked about.
Okay, my name is Pedro Lains. This story about race and status regime as a simplification that provides a currency for the complex world of globalization, as far as I understood, seems quite plausible, and I really like this story. But my question is, how much is this a European phenomena? Meaning, would you find this in other parts of the world in other periods of time? Is it still only an European phenomena in the present time, or you will find it, for example, in China, in the relationship between China and Africa and other parts of the world, or India and other parts of the world? How much is it European, or is it just a question of degree, and you'll find it strong with a strong presence in Europe from 1750 onwards? Okay, thank you.
That's a fascinating point and a very, very useful question, to which I can only give you a response that ends in a question mark. I think that I believe that the argument I'm making is a portable one, and that while the case I'm presenting is contained within the logics of the expansion of a form of European domination over an extended geographical and multi-ethnic space, that if we were to look at earlier forms of expansive political and economic orders, that we'd find similar kinds of compressions of local identities within contested status hierarchies, but which are being shaped by imaginaries from above and also from below. And I believe that we would find this quite probably in the relationship of the Han Chinese to the other communities within their cultural space. I think that we would find this in terms of the operation of Ottoman power and the accommodations to forms of local hierarchy. Some of this, we could argue, is already contained in theories of divide et impera and theories of indirect rule, that empires have always depended on forms of accommodation to local status hierarchies. I do think there's that if indeed we were to think about this problem of what are called empires in a very loose way, although I have a problem with that term, which I'll explain in a moment. But multi-ethnic, expansive social systems based on forms of domination by some and monopolization of advantage by some central ethnic group. It's a very bulky and baggy way to describe what are sometimes called empires. I have a problem with empire because empires is a word used rather promiscuously particularly in recent historical and social scientific thought. But my problem with this is that whenever West people in the West, and of course those who are using historic Western ideas in Asia and Africa and the Caribbean are also in the West in that sense, use the word empire, they're using a signifier which is powerfully determined by the forms which empire took, first of all in the Roman Empire, and secondly in terms of the post-1800 European empires. And I think that it involves a kind of, for example, there are some Chinese historians who would say that we don't like Chinese empire used for China. That I don't speak Chinese, but I think there's a Zhongzhou, the middle kingdom, is a preferable way of thinking about the kind of system of interacting ethnicities and polities which constitutes China as an entity. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of comparative global historical sociology to make sense of these kinds of processes of simplification.
José Manuel Sobral, ICS. Well, first of all, thanks for this very enlightening presentation. I would only raise this small point. You have been mostly referring to colonial settings linked to European domination, but it has been already pointed some decades ago that Europe was also a setting for the articulation between ideas of race and class and ethnicity. For instance, I remember Leon Poliakov pointing in his The Aryan Myth to the fact that the French high nobility in late 17th century were claiming to be from a different race based on bloodlines linked to ethnicity. For instance, they were the descendants of the Frankish who came to dominate the commoners, understood as the Gauls. What do you think about this kind also of process of making race, class, and ethnicity intersect?
I think that if we were to connect the last intervention of yours, I think that they're making at different scales very similar arguments. Does this also work at smaller scales? And I think it does. And I think that's in a way partly what this guides us to. There are forms, ideas of the integration of polities around these a kingdom like France involves these forms of hierarchical difference within the space of the nation state. I think you want to also look at Germany and the role of the Plattdeutsch Baltic German presence in the colonization and domination of Eastern Europe. Here we go way beyond my expertise grade, but I was listening to the Kreutzer Sonata a couple of months ago, and listening at the presence of what I take as kind of very Slavic musical forms operating. And it suddenly occurred to me that if one looks at German culture, what one has is a classic culture formed by forms of domination based on ethnic difference, in which there is a dominant register which comes out of that Western Rhineland, Plattdeutsch center through which Eastern Europe was dominated and colonized, and which has as its subordinate presence, rather in the way in which African American culture operates as this underground substrate to American United States culture. So we have in Germany this kind of subordinated Slavic presence within the political space, within the cultural space of what constitutes Germanness. So I think that this is a very interesting and complex point. And in a way, many of the kinds of much of the thinking I have here comes out also of reading from the ways in which people like Peter Burke have tried to think about social orders and social classification, and the way in which people like Norbert Elias have thought about forms of cultural accommodation and the generation of collective status identity. So I think that's your points are extremely valuable and would require another long response, I think, if I was to do proper justice to them.
Hey, hi, I'm Nick Miller. I'm part of the Color Project. So my question has to do with, it actually picks up on themes from both of the last questions. And basically it's, you use Western and European sort of interchangeably in the analysis. So could you maybe say some words about the place of the US in your analysis for the 19th century and 20th century? And also in terms of the question of empire, what do you make of Pagden's claim about the U.S. U.S. as non-empire?
No, I don't make much of Pagden's claim at all. I mean, I think the United States is a society constituted through forms of European imperialism, and which seeks, as its Declaration of Independence says, to be among the powers of the earth. That's to say, to join the club of imperial nations. And the organization of the United States as a post-colonial empire in the 19th century is, of course, the subject of AG Hopkins' new book, which was just published in last month, February 20th. So that I think that the interesting case of the United States is how it is constituted as a society and as a sub-empire of Britain, which is what it is in the early 19th century. The Monroe Doctrine is only, in a way, exists within the context of British hegemony in the 19th century. That the United States emerges as a society and as a kind of nascent imperial power at the same time as Europeans are consolidating their modern imperial systems based on the post-industrial technologies of warfare communication, and that what we have as in the United States is an important theater from which forms of racial imaginaries are being brought into dialogue with those in settler colonies in places like Australia and New Zealand, and also with colonial societies in South Africa, and also, of course, within Western Europe itself. I think a recent book, I can't remember its title, came out last year, raises the question of the impact of American racial formations on Nazi German constructions of racial imaginaries. But I mean, I think before that, sort of going for the Godwin point, I mean, I think more generally, the United States is an important and distinct theater of racial difference, which has a different racial demography from Brazil or from the Caribbean, and operates therefore in terms of constituting different kinds of status identities. I think I'm somehow kind of possibly losing the specificity of my response to your question. Could you focus me again in terms of, or am I kind of more or less answering what you're interested in? It was an open question, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The sort of like place of the U.S. in like being constitutive of this sort of like globalization of racial identities, but yeah.
No, it's an important theater, but one which has is able by the 20th century to begin to export some of its norms. So that if you look at some place like Panama, the Panama Canal Zone is a space in which American racial imaginaries come into collision with those coming out of the Anglophone Caribbean. And this produces a set of characteristic confrontations for which Garveyism is one response. But I think I would need to respond much more at length, I think, to do justice to that.
Thank you very much. I'm Francesco Vacchiano, here of the ICS. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very insightful, I think, and also it resonates very much with to me and with the contribution about the global hegemonies today and for the categories that shape the ethical and political imagination across the world, and particularly. I think it's very interesting also to see how these categories are parts of a global ethos which molds mainly this very widespread desire of being middle class across the contemporary world, and that's anthropologists, for example, are meeting across different sites in the world. But my question is more about the shift between imperialism, imperial project, and national project. I mean, I think that these categories are very powerful in producing. Of course, there is a strict relationship between imperialism and national formation, but in the contemporary world, also these forms of oversimplification of what we are and what the others are very powerful in the cohesions that's produced the current forms of political organization, which is nation. So
yes, that's a very helpful point. And of course, modern empires and modern nations are formations that are very closely related to each other. They're based precisely on these forms of geo-territorial, ethno-political identifications, for which Benedict Anderson, of course, is only one student. I think that these forms of oversimplifications have an efficiency. The crises which emerge in national communities around national identity have to do with where these collective identities, in fact, are colliding with status differences. So, to take, for example, I think one case which you're probably all familiar with, although I think it is understudied by social science, the origins of the civil war in Sri Lanka, and the forms of ethno-political difference between Sinhalese and Tamils in the construction, first of all, of colonial society in Ceylon, and then later on the evolution of national politics in Sri Lanka after 1948, and particularly after the 1970s. And this is a space in which the national idea ran into collision with the forms of ethnic domination of particular areas of state and society, generating the kinds of crises. The question is, of course, in other societies, these kinds of national identifications, take for example the case of someplace like Guyana, have an efficiency. They actually have an efficiency in those societies in which the alternative, there is no pre-colonial identity to be asserted. This society in some ways has been constituted in this form through this kind of collective identity. We are still in the midst of the aftermath of all of these forms of imperial globalization. And of course, Benedict Anderson's work began from his contemplation of the hegemonic relationship of the Javanese to post-colonial society in Indonesia. But there are other examples, Nigeria with the particular tensions between the northern and the southern components of society, ethnicity and military society. And one could look at a whole spectrum of global societies spread across these two extremes, one of which involves a kind of efficient accommodation of these kinds of national territorialized imperial ideas versus places where these are not efficient. Anyway, that's more a kind of descriptive rather than a profoundly illuminating response to your question.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think I've had so much fun at a lecture in such a long time. Both the lecture itself as well as the responses, the way you can go from location to location.
So, your name?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, the enthusiasm. Jason Keith Fernandez from from the institution next door. It has too long a name. I was really enthused by when you spoke about these kinds of class, race categories as being co-produced rather than emerging out and being imposed. Having said that, let me just throw out what's the bee in my bonnet over here. is that as the result of the nature or the rhetorics of Portuguese imperialism, at least in their location in South Asia, in Goa, you have a group within society that produce themselves as Portuguese, if not European, right? Known by the British in India as the Italians of India. So there's a certain production of oneself as European. So this is the bee in my bonnet. And the other bee is, it seems to me that, especially with reference to your skin whitening cream example, that whiteness has become, the distinctions have become sharper with decolonization, precisely because of the nature of decolonization, where imperial rhetorics have been abandoned to create national rhetorics, where the Europeanness no longer belongs to let's say these South Asians, but is firmly located within quotes Europe. So with my initial enthusiasm with being co-produced, it then seemed to me that as you were speaking, there seemed to be a kind of a shift where the Europeanness, with the idea of mimesis, where it seemed that these ideas, Europeanness belonged in the continent, and these people were only mimicking. Rather, what I'm trying to say is that perhaps these were, being co-produced. For example, when Victoria becomes empress, she's empress not because she controls this large, a huge portion of the empire, but because she's taking on a title of the Mughal emperor, right? And then subsequently they keep going on right until while they're building Delhi. So there's a certain kind of even Britishness that they are producing, at least the upper echelons are producing, that links itself with India. So there's if there is the co-production is happening on all sides, and I'm not trying to say that ignore power. Of course, there was a certain kind of imposition, but that this co-production perhaps could be taken a little further, maybe? I don't know. I'm sorry, just an open question.
No, that's a very, very, very valuable, contribution to what I was saying. And I'm particularly attracted by the argument you made that in the post-colonial situation, in some way that the phenomenon of the kind of performance of racial difference becomes more important rather than less important in the post-colonial situation. That had not occurred to me before, and I think it's a very interesting thought to explore. The larger point that there were forms of Indian Europeanness, Cape Town Europeanness, Port of Spain Europeanness, which were being constructed and in ways which cannot be possibly be simplified as whiteness, but had a particular order in terms of their cultural and associational and performative attributes. This is something which has to be taken seriously in terms of this co-production of class and race. There's also the possibility within colonial, or not the possibility, but the necessity in these colonial societies for forms of identity formation which do not presuppose Europe versus these places, but assumes instead that something new has been constituted, which represents the African, the whites of Africa, the Europeans of India. Is that approaching some of the point you were trying to make? I think that's absolutely true. And if one looks at some place, like and this is something, of course, I only began to think about having had dinner with Christiana, and I have to admit I did not even know that there was such a significant Madeiran Portuguese presence in Hawaii. But thinking about the Portuguese in Hawaii and trying to make sense of that, at least in my head before I came here, I think that's an interesting case too, where you have the emergence of a form of identity in Hawaii, which is fully American. They're all American citizens. They're fully Hawaiian in terms of how they locate themselves. They also will celebrate their difference as Portuguese and Madeiran, but they will also be assimilated to a particular construction of American whiteness within that particular society, which is a local form and is and cannot be reduced to something that's simply. So yes, I mean, I guess the most elegant response to your question is yes, I agree. There are going to be forms of irreducible difference, which are constituted in the midst of this economy of race and class in each of these theatres of encounter. Does that more or less respond? No, thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah Walsh, also from the Color Project.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, as you know,
Yes.
So as you know, one of the elements of this project is not only race and labor, but migration, and in a broader sense, movement. And so one of the ways that I think this connects to your talk is when you were talking about the origin of the word race, that it goes from people associated with a specific locality in, let's say, 1500, to people of a certain biological predisposition or set of components by the 1700s, let's say. And I guess this is more of a comment than anything else, which is to say that I wonder then if perhaps some of these things, race in particular, is not simply because people have been moving since forever. And in fact, I think one of the maybe epistemological problems with the idea of race is precisely that we pinpoint it to this moment of European imperial expansion when in fact people have been moving, right? So I wonder if, and especially if we look into the contemporary moment where people are doing their kind of 23andMe genealogical surveys of their past, and that the idea of the 1492 moment even goes insofar as to that genetic understanding of what your identity or history is. I wonder if then, if perhaps we can just think about race as relates to movement as kind of to do with scale rather than the fact that people are moving at all, that perhaps after 1492 it's about more people moving and moving further from these localities that they are kind of quote unquote supposed to be in.
Well, I think the key question would be not just simply movement, but moving from and to particular systems of power relations. And I think that what is characteristic of the post-1750 period is that one has, particularly in the 19th century, the construction of locations which are contained within forms of ideas of politics and economy and society, which have a kind of clear relationship to the modern order of politics, economy, and society in Western Europe. So when those who migrated from Madeira to British Guyana were migrating from into a colonial society which had its established set of hierarchies, and so therefore that's rather different. For example, from say if one was to take Amitav Ghosh's book In an Antique Land, where he describes this movement of merchants across this Islamic economic space from India to Spain, that might have been a kind of movement in which there was more kind of continuity, but also possibly that there might also be more difference. And so I think that movement within a space of towards to be inserted into a system of pre-existing power and cultural and social relations may be different from just simply forms of migration where there's not an established register. So this is not the best possible response, but I think you've made me ask myself the question: what difference would particular velocities of mobility make to this? That I think, for example, it's obviously very important that in terms of the migration of Italian agricultural labor to Argentina, that because of the steamship in the 19th century, that it was possible for Italian rural workers to work in the summer, in the harvest season in Italy, and then go and work in the other season in Argentina. And that creates a particular kind of diasporic relationship, which is very different from if you leave Madeira to go to Hawaii, and you do not expect to return home. And your relations are going to be mediated by far more delayed connections. And that may affect how one relates to these societies. One interesting project, which I think is obviously, Christiana has already assigned her budget for her project, however generous the ERC has been. But I am fascinated by the question of the locations of the Chinese, who are, of course, among the most important migrants in the 19th century world, and who situate themselves at a variety of social levels in a number of societies. In the Caribbean, for example, the Chinese come in as plantation workers, but end up essentially as part of the upper class, the middle class, and the working class. And they accommodate themselves to social roles. They play carnival in Trinidad. They participate in local masquerades. They join associational life, and sometimes they also have their separate Chinese societies. So the Chinese case is, I think, a particularly interesting one in terms of thinking about this problem of migration and of forms of cultural and social accommodation.
Thank you for your lecture. I'm Marcelo. I'm an invited researcher of the Color Project. Can you speak a bit more about the connections between whiteness, religion, morality, and the production of racial identities? I'm thinking here in the Portuguese case in British Guyana.
Yes. The forms of, inverted commas, civilized cultural life, whether it was the acquisition of literacy, or the participation in some form of organized religious order. This represented a mechanism through which one could perform kinds of respectability, either as a member of a working class. One could transform oneself from working class to lower middle class through these forms of cultural avocation. However, there were always going to be limits, and that class would restrict one's degree of mobility, as indeed would ethnicity. One interesting case of that is society in Trinidad. Trinidad had a very old French plantocracy that had migrated there in the 18th century when it was still a Spanish colony. Some of them from revolutionary Saint-Domingue, some from the rest, to create what was called the French Creole population. English colonial society sought in a very aggressive way to impose Anglophone forms of politics and society, so that you had these great landowners who had French aristocratic titles, who performed a certain kind of elite status, but were not Anglophone, were not Protestant, were not Anglican, and therefore could not be part of the ruling echelon of that colonial society. So that if this would work not just for the lower classes, it would also work for elites in terms of in which one's performance of cultural difference, if one was a Roman Catholic, as your people, Madeirans, were in British Guyana, might actually allow you to raise your status in some ways while excluding you in others. In terms of a society which had at its center an Anglophone Protestant political and economic elite. So again, culture, the performance of civilization is an important modifying factor.
If not, I'll take it. Okay. Okay. So, what's your position regarding the use of plantation in an expanded way about systems that are not really about planting or industrial agriculture, or can be even manufacturers, mills, etc.?
I think that I would need to answer that question on the specific rather than the general. I think that there is a power to recognizing the way in which forms of latifundial economic organization based on the matching of class and ethnic difference reproduced particular characteristic social and economic forms in the colonial world in the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries, some of which then mapped onto forms of labor regimes, possibly, although I don't know enough about this in terms of the export processing zone in Mauritius, the kind of the forms of racialized labor, organized, which have a clear generic relationship to the forms of society created in plantation society. I can admit that in terms of the portability of the concept. There are risks, however, obviously, in terms of the distortion of what are new forms of social relations, which have a historical relationship to the plantation, but yet have acquired distinctive differences.
And I will thank you very much again, Richard. This was a fantastic time of work, and thank you all for being here and participating in such a creative manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much.